guys, so I'm here today to share with you my current top 5 poets. I do really enjoy poetry. I think there is a lot of different kinds of poetry out there, and if you don't think you like poetry, then there's a good chance you maybe just haven't read the right kind of poetry for you. That's not to say it just isn't for some people, but I definitely think if you're trying to get into poetry, it's worth trying a few different types of poetry before you decide either way. Although I generally have quite an eclectic reading taste and I'm happy to try new things, and I do like poets that do quite a few different things, I do also have my favourites and quite a specific taste in what really grabs me with poetry and what really moves me. So I think there's definitely some reoccurring themes in the works of the poets I have here and the styles in which they write. I also think that at least 4, if not all of the poets in this video are incredibly accessible for those of you that are just trying to get into reading poetry and haven't really read much before. I particularly like poetry that deals with quite universal messages, heavy topics, big topics, rather than necessarily individuals' feelings and things like that. I do enjoy a bit of that now and then, but if you know what I mean, that's kind of what I like my poetry to do. I like it to be punchy and have a clear message. I like it to be quite catchy. I like it to have a nice rhythm. I love a bit of a random rhyming pattern. Although I don't need all of my poems to be written in rhyming couplets, I do enjoy when there's a bit of an irregular rhyming pattern in there. I do also very much enjoy poetry with a comical edge, but in saying those are the things I like, I think the poets I have here to talk about write quite a variety of stuff. But I thought it might just be a little bit helpful to tell you what kind of thing I like before I get into talking about the poets. I have only gone for modern contemporary poets. Obviously I do love some ancient poetry, but I have actually previously done a video all about ancient poetry, an introduction to ancient poetry, where you might want to start with ancient poetry. So if you're interested in that, I'll link it up here, I'll link it down there, as per usual. But without further rambling, let's get into the poets. I'm going to go chronologically from probably the poet who got me into poetry, and that is Michael Rosen. These are both collections of his adult poetry, but it was his children's poetry that first really got me into poetry as a child. That and probably the nonsense poetry of Edward Lear. It definitely sparked an interest in poetry for me and made me keen to continue reading it and developing my taste as I grew up. Luckily for me though, Michael Rosen's adult poetry is just as fabulous as his children's poetry. So this one I most recently read the full collection of is Fighters for Life Selected Poems, and it deals a lot with social issues and politics in these poems. And since then I picked up Don't Mention the Children, which is quite a bit chunkier collection here and has quite a varied selection in it from what I've dipped into so far, some of it being more amusing like his children's poetry and some of it being a little more serious like Fighters for Life. I'm not sure what the protocol is really on reading bits from poetry collections in videos without it infringing on copyright, but luckily for you, Michael Rosen posts a lot of poetry on his blog for public consumption that you can read for free, and I will link that down below so you can get a bit of a taster for the stuff he does. But next up is probably the poet I've been a fan of for the longest after Michael Rosen, and that is Benjamin Zephaniah. He particularly writes quite punchy performance poetry that sounds amazing read out loud and has a fantastic beat to it. This collection I have here is a little book of vegan poems and proper propaganda, and like the titles of these suggest, he also writes about kind of social justice and political topics, things that he's really passionate about and wants to spread the word about, and he just writes the most accessible, wonderful poetry that really resonates with you when you hear or read it. And I know in fact that some of his performances can be found on YouTube, so I will link any of those I can find down below so you can get another taste for that if you'd like to hear it. But he is absolutely fantastic. He also writes some phenomenal YA books that deal with quite heavy topics that I don't really see other YA authors do. So if that's also your cup of tea, it might be worth checking out. But it's his poetry in particular that really warms my heart and makes me feel incredibly politically invigorated and inspired, so would highly recommend his stuff. But next up is a poet you'll probably have heard me mention before, and that is Kate Tempest. I first got into Kate Tempest around the end of 2014 and have just been absolutely enamoured by her work ever since. It's really her collection Hold Your Own that blew me away and has stayed with me, and I've since reread many of the poems inside it. But she does also have an earlier collection called Brand New Ancients. Hold Your Own is a really fantastic mixture of things, so it deals with more personal topics and bigger issues. It's also, like Brand New Ancients, inspired somewhat by Greek mythology, but dealing with contemporary characters. And in particular, this collection plays around a lot with gender and explores different gendered issues and brings them to life in what is just an amazing lyrics. She is a rap artist as well as a poet, and that wonderful rhythm and beat is so apparent in her poetry. I could never do it justice to read it out loud, but again, she's another one I know there's some performances of on YouTube, so I'll link them down below. In particular, one of her poems, Ballad of a Hero or War Music, makes me cry every time I hear it. But next up is probably the newest poet to have an impact on my life, and that is Megan Beach, and this is her collection When I Grow Up I Want to Be Mary Beard. And if you know me, then I was probably going to love this book just based on the title. I think Mary Beard is absolutely fabulous, and this is a fabulous collection. It is definitely a feminist poetry collection. It deals a lot with being a woman and being a woman specifically in the digital age, and it makes you feel very empowered and invigorated and helps take away that feeling of loneliness you can sometimes feel being a woman or being a feminist online. And I honestly think anybody who reads this would find it incredibly empowering and inspiring. But lastly, is a poet I think is probably the least similar in the bunch, and that is Don Patterson. This is one of his collections, 40 Sonnets. This is his most recent collection, in fact, but I've read a few of his collections. And there's just something about Don Patterson's poetry that really moves me. I find it very beautiful. I think he particularly has very beautiful, elegant writing, and it's just a really gorgeous reading experience. I'm sure if they don't already, they'll be teaching Don Patterson in schools at some point. There's poems in here covering topics from grief to the Dundee City Council. And like all of the poets in this video, I would highly recommend you check out his stuff. But for the sake of brevity, I narrowed it down to a current top 5 for this video. There are, of course, lots of other poets who I greatly admire and enjoy the work of, and I will make certain to make a honourable mentions list down in the description box down below, so you have a few more people to check out, from Holly McNish to George the Poet to Jen Campbell. There are so many other wonderful poets out there whose work brings me joy, and I would love if you had the opportunity to feel that way too. So do let me know who your favourite poets are. I would love to hear and maybe discover some new poets. And if you intend to check out any of the poets I mentioned in this video, then also let me know. But until next time guys, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye! So I have quite a large pile of books here that I have acquired over the past few weeks during the month of July. Naturally, that means a book haul.